The moment Tamar Braxton finally started speaking openly, something shifted that fans couldn't ignore. It wasn't loud or explosive at first. It was subtle, almost careful, like someone choosing their words after years of holding them back. But then Ashlee Braxton stepped in, and suddenly the silence that had surrounded them for so long began to feel intentional, not accidental. For years, people questioned why certain moments were never addressed, why tensions seemed to disappear instead of resolve, and why stories that looked unfinished were quietly left behind. Now, according to them, that silence came at a cost. What makes this even more complicated is how their explanation connects to past situations fans thought they understood. Because as their words started circulating, attention quickly turned toward Evelyn Braxton. Not with direct blame, but with curiosity about what role she may have played in shaping how things unfolded behind the scenes. And here's where it gets intense. This isn't just about what was said, it's about what wasn't. Because when silence lasts this long, breaking it doesn't just tell a story, it rewrites everything people thought they knew. To really understand why Tamar Braxton and Ashlee Braxton are speaking now, you have to go back to a time when everything looked loud on the surface, but was surprisingly quiet underneath. From the outside, the Braxton family dynamic always appeared expressive, emotional, and sometimes even chaotic in a way that made for compelling television. Viewers saw arguments, reconciliations, and moments of vulnerability that felt raw and real. But according to Tamar and Ashlee, what the audience didn't see was just as important as what they did. During that period, Tamar was navigating one of the most intense phases of her career. Between reality television, music, and public appearances, she was constantly in the spotlight. Every reaction, every comment, every emotional moment was captured and amplified. But with that visibility came pressure. Not just the pressure to perform or entertain, but the pressure to maintain relationships, protect opportunities, and avoid being labeled in ways that could follow her for years. In industries like entertainment, reputation isn't just about public perception. It can shape access, influence, and long-term stability. Ashlee's experience, while different in visibility, was deeply connected. She wasn't always at the center of the camera, but she was still part of the narrative. And according to her, that position came with its own challenges. Being close enough to the situation to be affected by it, but not always having the platform to address it, created a kind of imbalance. She has suggested that there were moments when conversations were happening about her, around her, and even involving her, without her having the space to respond publicly. Over time, that kind of dynamic can create frustration, especially when the story being told doesn't fully reflect your perspective. What makes their current explanation so compelling is how they describe silence, not as avoidance, but as something much more calculated. Tamar has implied that speaking out at certain moments didn't just carry emotional risk, it carried professional consequences. Being seen as difficult, uncooperative, or disruptive can have lasting effects in an industry where relationships and perception matter so much. And while those consequences aren't always stated outright, they can be felt in subtle ways. Opportunities can shift. Support can fade. Access can change. According to their perspective, silence became a way to navigate those risks, even if it meant allowing misunderstandings to exist. This is where the conversation begins to touch on something bigger than just one family. Because what Tamar and Ashlee are describing isn't entirely unfamiliar in entertainment spaces. There are often unspoken rules about when to speak, how to speak, and whether speaking at all is worth the potential fallout. And when those rules aren't clearly defined, they can create a sense of uncertainty that makes silence feel like the safest option. At the same time, the role of Evelyn Braxton has naturally come into focus. Not because Tamar and Ashlee have made direct accusations, but because of her position within the family dynamic. As a matriarch, her presence carries influence, both emotionally and structurally. Fans have begun revisiting past interactions, looking for moments that might hint at how decisions were made or how certain situations were handled behind the scenes. It's important to note that much of this remains speculative. However, the curiosity itself highlights how central her role is perceived to be in shaping the family's narrative. Back then, many of the conflicts that played out publicly seemed to resolve quickly or fade without full explanation. Arguments would escalate, emotions would rise, and then suddenly, things would go quiet. At the time, some viewers interpreted that as resolution. Others felt like something was missing, like chapters of the story were being skipped. Now, Tamar and Ashlee's comments are giving those moments new context. They are suggesting that what looked like resolution may have actually been restraint. And restraint, as they describe it, isn't always voluntary. Sometimes it's influenced by timing, by external pressures, or by the understanding that speaking too soon could make things worse rather than better. Tamar has hinted that there were moments when she wanted to say more, when she felt that her side of the story wasn't being fully represented. But instead of addressing it directly, she chose to hold back. Not because she didn't have anything to say, but because saying it might have come with consequences she wasn't ready to face at the time. Ashlee's perspective adds another layer to this. Watching narratives form without your input can be a difficult experience, especially when those narratives begin to solidify into public opinion. Over time, silence can be misinterpreted. People may assume that not speaking means agreement, or that it confirms whatever version of events is most visible. But according to Ashlee, that assumption doesn't always reflect reality. Sometimes silence is simply the result of not having the right moment, the right platform, or the right level of safety to speak openly. As the years passed, those unaddressed moments didn't disappear. Instead, they lingered, becoming part of the family's public history. Fans continued to reference them, debate them, and build theories around them. Without new information, those theories often filled in the gaps, shaping how people understood what had happened. Tamar and Ashlee have now suggested that by staying silent, they were essentially allowing those interpretations to take root, even if they didn't fully align with their own experiences. What has changed now, according to their narrative, is timing. Tamar is in a different place professionally and personally. She appears to have more control over her platform, more confidence in her voice, and fewer reasons to hold back. Ashlee, too, seems more willing to step forward and share her perspective without the same level of hesitation. That shift in timing is significant, because it changes the risk calculation. What may have felt too costly to say before now feels possible. Their decision to speak isn't framed as an attempt to rewrite history, but rather to add context that was missing when those moments originally unfolded. It's about explaining the silence, not just breaking it. And in doing so, they're asking the audience to reconsider what they thought they knew. Because when you look back at those earlier moments with this new perspective, they start to feel different. The pauses, the avoided questions, the sudden shifts in conversation, they don't necessarily signal avoidance anymore. They might signal something more complex, something shaped by factors that weren't visible at the time. And that's what makes this part of the story so important. It sets the foundation for everything that follows. Because if silence wasn't just silence, then every moment built on that silence carries a new meaning. And as Tamar and Ashlee continue to share their perspective, the question becomes less about what happened back then and more about why it unfolded the way it did. As Tamar and Ashlee's words continued to circulate, the conversation didn't just grow, it shifted. What started as curiosity quickly turned into something more intense, more layered, and far more emotional than anyone expected. Because once people began to reconsider the past through this new lens, it wasn't just about understanding silence anymore. It was about questioning everything that had been built on top of it. The first real turning point came when fans started revisiting specific moments from the past, not casually, but with intent. Old clips resurfaced, interviews were replayed, and scenes that once felt straightforward suddenly carried a different energy. Viewers noticed pauses that seemed longer than they remembered, reactions that felt more controlled than natural, and conversations that appeared to stop just short of something important. It created a sense that maybe those moments weren't incomplete by accident. Maybe they had been intentionally left that way. And as this re-examination unfolded, Tamar Braxton found herself at the center of it all again, but this time, not as someone reacting in the moment, but as someone reframing it. Her tone, according to many observers, didn't come across as explosive or accusatory. Instead, it carried a kind of exhaustion, like someone finally explaining something they had been holding in for too long. That emotional shift mattered, because it made people listen differently. It wasn't about proving a point. It felt like explaining a weight. At the same time, Ashlee Braxton's perspective added a quieter, but equally powerful layer. While Tamar's past visibility had already shaped public perception, Ashlee's voice felt like something that had been missing entirely. And that absence became part of the conversation. Fans began asking why her perspective hadn't been heard before, and whether that absence had influenced how the story was understood. Her presence now didn't just add information, it changed the balance of the narrative. Then came the part that made everything more complicated. As people began to connect their statements to past tensions, attention inevitably turned toward Evelyn Braxton. Not in a direct or accusatory way, but in a way that raised questions about influence and dynamics. In families, especially ones that operate under public scrutiny, roles carry weight. And as the matriarch, Evelyn's presence has always been central, even in moments where she wasn't speaking directly. Fans began to wonder whether the silence Tamar and Ashlee described was shaped, at least in part, by those family dynamics. Was it about protecting relationships? Maintaining unity? Avoiding deeper conflict? Or was it something more subtle? An unspoken understanding of how far certain conversations could go publicly? None of these questions came with clear answers, but their existence alone added tension to the narrative. Meanwhile, the public reaction became more divided. Some people embraced Tamar and Ashlee's explanation, saying it finally made sense of moments that had always felt confusing. They saw the silence as strategic, even necessary, given the circumstances being described. To them, this wasn't about avoiding the truth. It was about surviving within a system that didn't always reward openness. Others, however, remained cautious. They pointed out that revisiting the past years later comes with its own challenges. Memory can shift. Perspectives can evolve. And without hearing every side of the story, it's difficult to fully understand what really happened. These voices didn't dismiss Tamar and Ashlee's experience, but they emphasized the importance of context, reminding everyone that narratives are rarely one-dimensional. This tension between belief and caution kept the conversation active. It wasn't collapsing into a single conclusion. Instead, it expanded, making space for multiple interpretations at once. And in that space, the story became less about assigning blame and more about understanding how it all unfolded. Another major shift came from how people started talking about power, not in an obvious or dramatic way, but in a more nuanced sense. Tamar and Ashlee didn't describe their silence as the result of a single moment or decision. Instead, they suggested it was shaped by an environment, by a series of pressures that made speaking feel risky. That idea resonated with many viewers, especially those familiar with how entertainment industries operate behind the scenes. Because power doesn't always look like control in the traditional sense. Sometimes it looks like influence, like access, like the ability to shape narratives without saying a word. And when one perspective becomes more visible than another, it can quietly become the dominant version of events. Tamar and Ashlee's explanation challenged that dynamic, not by directly opposing it, but by adding another layer to it. As the story continued to unfold, another question began to surface: why now? Why speak after all this time? For some, the answer seemed clear. Timing changes everything. Tamar appears to be in a different phase of her life and career, one where she has more control over her voice and fewer constraints on what she can say. Ashlee, too, seems more confident stepping into a public role, less hesitant to share her perspective. But for others, that timing raised its own questions. Does speaking later change how the message is received? Does it strengthen it, or does it create doubt? These questions didn't have simple answers, but they added another layer of complexity to an already intricate situation. What became undeniable, however, was the emotional impact of breaking that silence. Because once it was broken, it couldn't be undone. The story had shifted. The past had been reopened. And the narrative that had once felt settled was now being reconsidered in real time. Even within the family, the ripple effects of this shift were impossible to ignore. When long-held silence is replaced with new perspective, it doesn't just affect the audience. It affects relationships, conversations, and the way people understand each other moving forward. Whether those effects lead to healing or further tension remains uncertain, but their presence is undeniable. And just when it seemed like the conversation had reached its peak, new hints began to emerge, suggesting that there might still be more beneath the surface. Not necessarily explosive revelations, but deeper context, details that could further reshape how everything is understood. These whispers didn't provide answers, but they kept the tension alive, reminding everyone that this story might not be finished yet. Because in situations like this, the most powerful moments aren't always the loudest ones. Sometimes they're the quiet realizations, the shifts in understanding that happen when new information changes how the past is seen. And right now, that shift is still happening, still unfolding, still leaving room for what might come next. By the time the conversation reached this stage, the impact of what Tamar Braxton and Ashlee Braxton had shared was no longer just about explanation. It had turned into a ripple effect that touched everything connected to their past: relationships, public perception, and even the way fans understood the Braxton family as a whole. Because once silence is reframed as something intentional rather than accidental, it forces people to revisit every moment that came before it. One of the most immediate consequences was the shift in how audiences interpreted old conflicts. Scenes that once felt resolved suddenly seemed unfinished. Conversations that appeared closed now felt like they had been paused rather than concluded. And perhaps most importantly, emotional reactions that were once dismissed as overreactions began to look different. With this new context, they carried a sense of restraint, like there was more being held back than what was shown. This reevaluation didn't happen quietly. Social media became a space where fans openly debated what they were seeing. Some expressed empathy, saying Tamar and Ashlee's explanation finally gave clarity to moments that had always felt confusing. Others remained skeptical, questioning whether revisiting the past after so much time had passed could ever provide a complete picture. But even within that skepticism, there was acknowledgement that something about the story now felt more layered than before. At the center of this evolving narrative, Evelyn Braxton's role continued to draw attention, not because of direct accusations, but because of what her position represents. As the family matriarch, her influence has always been significant, whether expressed openly or felt more subtly. Fans began reflecting on how family dynamics, especially in a public setting, can shape not only decisions, but also what gets shared and what remains unspoken. It's important to recognize that Tamar and Ashlee never framed their experience as a direct confrontation. Instead, they spoke about environment, about pressure that didn't need to be explicitly stated to be understood. That distinction matters, because it shifts the focus away from individuals and toward systems. Systems of expectation, reputation, and control that can exist even in close-knit families, especially when those families are also part of a public brand. As this perspective gained traction, the idea of forced silence began to take on a more nuanced meaning. It wasn't about someone issuing a command or enforcing a rule. It was about circumstances aligning in a way that made silence feel like the safest option. Contracts, public image, professional relationships, and personal bonds all intersecting to create a situation where speaking freely didn't feel possible. For Tamar, this period appears to have been particularly heavy. Being one of the most visible members of the family meant that her reactions were constantly under scrutiny. Every word she said carried weight, and every word she didn't say carried implication. Holding back in that environment isn't just a choice, it's a constant calculation. And over time, that kind of calculation can take an emotional toll, especially when it means watching narratives form that don't fully represent your experience. Ashlee's journey through this has its own complexity. Being less visible doesn't necessarily mean being less affected. In many ways, it can create a different kind of pressure, one where your story exists in the background, shaped by others without your input. Her decision to speak now suggests a shift, not just in confidence, but in the conditions that once made silence feel necessary. As both sisters shared their perspectives, another layer of the story began to emerge, the idea that silence doesn't just affect the moment it exists in. It carries forward, influencing how events are remembered and understood long after they've passed. When narratives are built without all voices present, they can solidify in ways that are difficult to challenge later. Tamar and Ashlee's decision to speak now isn't just about addressing the past. It's about reshaping how that past is interpreted moving forward. This has also had an impact on how fans view reality television as a whole. There's a growing awareness that what is shown on screen is only part of the story. Editing, timing, and production choices all play a role in shaping what audiences see. And when someone chooses, or feels compelled, to stay silent, those gaps don't remain empty. They get filled, often with assumptions that may or may not reflect reality. The conversation has begun to move beyond this specific situation into a broader discussion about media literacy. About understanding that silence can have many meanings. And that not all of them are visible. This doesn't mean accepting every explanation without question, but it does mean being open to the idea that there are factors at play that audiences don't always see. At the same time, the emotional reality of the situation remains central. Breaking years of silence isn't just a strategic decision, it's a personal one. It involves revisiting moments that may have been difficult, reopening conversations that were left unresolved, and facing reactions that can't be controlled. Tamar and Ashlee's willingness to do that suggests that whatever kept them silent before no longer holds the same weight. But even with that shift, the story doesn't feel finished. If anything, it feels like it has entered a new phase, one where the focus is less on what happened and more on what it means. What it means for the family, for their relationships, and for how they move forward from here. Because breaking silence doesn't automatically create resolution. It creates awareness. It opens the door to conversation, to reflection, and sometimes to conflict. Whether that leads to healing or further tension depends on what happens next, and that part of the story is still unfolding. There's also the lingering question of perspective. Tamar and Ashlee have shared their experience, but like any complex situation, there are likely other viewpoints that haven't been fully explored publicly. That doesn't invalidate what they've said, but it does remind us that stories like this are rarely one-dimensional. They exist in layers, shaped by different experiences, emotions, and interpretations. As the dust begins to settle, one thing becomes clear. The silence that once defined this chapter of their story is no longer there. In its place is a narrative that feels more open, more complicated, and far more human. It's not about neat conclusions or clear answers. It's about understanding that sometimes, the most important parts of a story are the ones that take the longest to be told. And even now, with everything that's been shared, there's still a sense that something remains just out of reach. Not necessarily a hidden secret, but a deeper understanding that hasn't fully surfaced yet. That lingering uncertainty is what keeps people watching, listening, and questioning. Because when silence lasts for years, breaking it doesn't just end a story. It transforms it. And right now, that transformation is still in progress, leaving everyone, fans, observers, and even the family themselves, waiting to see what comes next. Now I want to hear from you, because this story isn't just about what Tamar Braxton and Ashlee Braxton said, it's about how you interpret it. After everything they've shared about staying silent for years, do you believe that silence was truly about pressure and timing? Or do you think there's still more to the story that hasn't come out yet? And what are your thoughts on Evelyn Braxton's role in all of this? Do you think her influence shaped how things played out behind the scenes? Or is the situation being read too deeply by fans trying to connect the dots? These are the kinds of questions that don't have simple answers, and that's exactly why this conversation is so important. Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because your perspective adds another layer to this story. Let's really talk about it. And if you made it this far, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. Because if more details start to surface, and honestly, it feels like they might, you're definitely going to want to be part of that conversation.